Police discovered a tunnel under Shaquille O'Neal's villa, but what they found inside shocked everyone. What was hiding under the NBA legend's house? Subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Greenville had always been the kind of place where neighbors greeted each other with a smile. Lawns were kept neatly trimmed, and the loudest noise came from the occasional children's birthday party. It was a sort of town where secrets struggled to hide, and privacy often seemed more like an illusion than a reality. Residents took pride in knowing each other's business, but it was never meant to be malicious. Gossip, after all, was just part of life in Greenville, a way to pass the time and keep the community connected. That was until Shaquille O'Neal moved into the neighborhood. His arrival was the talk of the town for weeks. People gawked as moving trucks rolled up to the massive villa at the end of Willow Lane, unloading endless crates and furniture that hinted at unimaginable wealth. The basketball legend's name was whispered with both admiration and curiosity. What was he doing here, in such a quiet suburban enclave? Was he retiring, hiding, or simply craving a normal life away from the glare of the media? At first, his presence was a point of pride for the neighborhood. Residents boasted to friends and relatives that they lived just a few houses down from Shaq. They craned their necks whenever he jogged past and tried to spot him through the tinted windows of his luxury vehicles. But admiration quickly turned into unease. The first thing people noticed was the trucks. They came at odd hours, usually late at night, and left just before dawn. The drivers were nondescript, wearing dark clothing and gloves, moving quickly and purposefully. Sometimes the trucks carried large crates, other times smaller containers. No one could figure out what was being delivered or removed, but the secrecy surrounding it made imaginations run wild. Then came the lights. Strange flashes emanated from the basement windows, like lightning trapped underground. Some neighbors swore they saw faint beams piercing through cracks in the foundation late at night, pulsing rhythmically as if signaling someone or something. And the smell. That was what tipped the scales. It started as a faint, sour odor, barely noticeable at first, but it grew stronger, more pungent, until it seemed to seep into the very walls of the nearby homes. It was sharp, almost chemical, with an undertone of decay that made stomachs churn. People began to complain, whispering about rotting meat or toxic spills. Leading the charge was Miss Janice. Miss Janice had lived in Greenville for nearly 30 years. Twice divorced and fiercely independent, she was the kind of woman who prided herself on keeping her lawn immaculate and her opinions sharper than a knife. Her past had left her suspicious of others, particularly men, and Shaquille O'Neal, with his wealth, fame, and closed-off demeanor, was no exception. She was the first to voice her suspicions aloud. "There's something going on in that house," she said during a neighborhood watch meeting. "You all see it, you smell it, and yet no one's doing a thing about it." A murmur rippled through the small group gathered in her living room. Some nodded, while others shifted uncomfortably. "I don't know," said Tom, a young father who had moved in a year ago. "I mean, it's Shaquille O'Neal. Why would he? Because people like him think they can do whatever they want." Janice cut him off. "Money doesn't make someone trustworthy. If anything, it makes them dangerous. He could be hiding anything in that house. Drugs, stolen goods, people." "People?" Lisa, Tom's wife, raised an eyebrow. "Yes, people," Janice said firmly. "Trafficking, smuggling. You've read the stories. Rich men like him always think they're above the law." Tom opened his mouth to respond, but Janice wasn't finished. "We need to do something before it's too late. before whatever's happening in that house spreads to the rest of us. By the time the meeting ended, the seeds of doubt had been planted. Over the next few weeks, the neighborhood became a hive of speculation. People began watching Shaquille's house more closely, documenting every delivery, every flicker of light. Miss Janice went so far as to set up a camera in her window, pointed directly at the villa. It wasn't long before rumors reached a boiling point. The smell grew worse, lingering even during the day. A few neighbors claimed they heard faint cries or whispers coming from the property at night, though no one could confirm it. And then there were the children, or at least what some claimed were children. Small, shadowy figures glimpsed through the basement windows, moving too quickly to be identified. By now, Janice was convinced. She began compiling notes, printing articles about human trafficking and illegal shelters. She reached out to a former police officer who lived 2 streets away, Mr. Harper, hoping his experience could lend credibility to her accusations. Harper was skeptical at first. He'd spent his career following evidence, not hunches, but after visiting Janice's house and seeing the hours of footage she'd collected, even he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. "It's probably nothing," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. "But I'll make a few calls. Better safe than sorry." The call to the police was made the following morning. By noon, 2 patrol cars and an unmarked vehicle had arrived outside Shaquille's house. The sight of flashing lights drew residents out of their homes, clustering along sidewalks and lawns as officers approached the villa's towering front door. When Shaquille finally appeared, he looked as calm as ever, dressed in workout clothes and holding a protein shake. He greeted the officers politely, towering over them as they presented the search warrant. The crowd watched, breathless, as he stepped aside and allowed them inside. Some neighbors hoped for a quick resolution, proof that everything was fine and their worries had been unfounded. Others, like Janice, braced for something far darker. It didn't take long for the officers to find the door leading to the basement. Moments later, the murmurs outside turned to gasps as one officer emerged and whispered something to his partner. More police were called in. The house was sealed off, and the rumors turned into full-blown panic. "What did I tell you?" Janice hissed, her voice sharp with vindication. "I knew it. I knew he was hiding something." But even she wasn't prepared for what lay beneath the villa. As more officers disappeared into the basement, dragging equipment and flashlights behind them, the tension in the air became suffocating. The crowd outside swelled, reporters now joining the ranks, cameras flashing as they tried to capture the unfolding drama. And through it all, Shaquille O'Neal remained silent, his face unreadable as he stood on the porch, watching his home become the center of a storm he could no longer control. The flashing lights of police cars painted the quiet streets of Greenville in streaks of red and blue. Neighbors gathered in clusters, whispering and pointing toward the villa as uniformed officers moved in and out of the towering structure. Shaquille O'Neal stood on his porch, his massive frame casting a long shadow under the glow of the floodlights. He looked calm, but there was an unmistakable tension in the air, a weight pressing down on the crowd as they awaited answers. Inside the villa, the search had already begun. Officers methodically combed through the expansive rooms, checking closets, cabinets, and storage areas. Everything about the house was pristine. Gleaming floors, elegant furniture, and framed memorabilia from Shaquille's career. It didn't match the sinister rumors swirling outside, but the smell remained. That sour, lingering odor grew stronger as they descended into the basement. The basement was cavernous, far larger than anyone had expected. Rows of shelves lined the walls, stocked with canned food, bottled water, and medical supplies. A generator hummed in the corner, and ventilation pipes snaked overhead, pumping fresh air into the space. It was more than a storage area. It looked like a bunker. But it was the far wall that drew the officer's attention. A steel door, bolted shut and marked with no visible handles, loomed ominously at the end of the room. The lead officer radioed for backup as they began examining it, running their hands along the edges until someone found the release mechanism hidden in the frame. With a heavy click, the door unlocked and slowly swung open, revealing a narrow staircase descending even further underground. The officers exchanged uneasy glances before turning on their flashlights and stepping inside. What they found was far from what anyone had expected. The tunnel stretched for what seemed like miles, reinforced with concrete walls and dimly lit by a series of hanging bulbs. The air was cooler here, damp and faintly metallic. As they moved deeper, the smell grew stronger, almost overwhelming, until they reached the first room. It was small but carefully furnished. 2 bunk beds against one wall, a bookshelf filled with children's books, and a plastic bin overflowing with toys. A small table and chairs sat in the center, surrounded by coloring books and crayons. The officers froze, taking in the scene. It was clear that someone had been living here. Further down the tunnel, they found more rooms, each similar but varying in size. Some had medical cots with blankets neatly folded at the foot of each bed. Others had shelves filled with clothes, shoes, and hygiene products. There was even a playroom, complete with a chalkboard and puzzles scattered across the floor. The discovery sent a shockwave through the officers. They radioed back to the surface, calling for additional units and alerting their superiors. Outside, the growing crowd sensed the shift in tone. The officers emerging from the basement wore grim expressions, and their hurried movements fueled the fire of speculation. Reporters began snapping photos, and neighbors pressed closer, desperate for information. Miss Janice was at the front, her eyes wide with vindication. "I knew it," she muttered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "I knew something wasn't right." Her words spread like wildfire. Within minutes, the whispers turned into accusations. Some claimed the rooms were part of a trafficking operation, while others insisted they had uncovered a secret cult. The sight of officers carrying evidence bags out of the house only added fuel to the panic. Inside, Shaquille O'Neal sat at his dining table, flanked by 2 officers. His calm demeanor had cracked, replaced by a quiet weariness. He didn't speak as they cataloged the items they had found, nor did he flinch when they mentioned bringing in forensic teams. When asked about the tunnel, he simply said, "I'll explain everything." But the explanation would have to wait. As night fell, police erected barricades around the property, keeping the swelling crowd at bay. Reporters shouted questions from beyond the tape, their voices drowned out by the hum of helicopters circling overhead. The once quiet neighborhood had become a media circus. Back inside the villa, the investigation continued. The police uncovered ledgers containing lists of names and dates. Photos of children, some smiling and others staring blankly at the camera, were tucked into folders alongside medical records. Maps and transportation routes were pinned to corkboards, and a stack of passports sat locked inside a metal cabinet. To the officers, it looked like evidence of a sophisticated smuggling network. They pressed Shaquille for answers, but he remained tight-lipped, asking to speak to his lawyer before making any statements. Outside, the neighbors' imaginations ran wild. Miss Janice, emboldened by the apparent confirmation of her suspicions, took center stage. She described the strange trucks, the flashing lights, and the awful smell to anyone who would listen. She painted a picture of exploitation and deceit, weaving a narrative that left little room for doubt. Tom and Lisa, who had initially defended Shaquille, began to waver. The sight of the evidence bags and the sheer scale of the tunnel shook their faith in his innocence. Even Mr. Harper, the former officer, struggled to reconcile the man he had met with the findings beneath his home. By the end of the night, the court of public opinion had rendered its verdict. Shaquille O'Neal was guilty, if not legally, then morally. The only question that remained was, guilty of what? As the investigation continued, police uncovered more unsettling details. Medical charts hinted at illnesses and injuries among the children, raising questions about their welfare. Some of the drawings found in the rooms depicted scenes of violence, burning buildings, soldiers with guns, and families separated by fences. The smell, it turned out, came from a broken septic system connected to the underground shelter, but that did little to ease the neighbors' fears. Shaquille O'Neal, once a local celebrity, was now the face of a growing scandal. His silence only made things worse, leaving room for rumors to fill the void. And as the night dragged on, Miss Janice stood at the edge of the crowd, her arms crossed and her eyes fixed on the villa. She had spent years distrusting people, convinced that everyone had something to hide. Now, for the first time, she was sure she had been right. The sun rose sluggishly over Greenville, casting a muted glow on streets that had barely slept. The once quiet neighborhood now resembled a crime scene from a television drama. Yellow tape cordoned off Shaquille O'Neal's property, and news vans lined the curbs, their antennas reaching skyward like metal spires. Reporters jostled for position, cameras rolling as they recounted the night's events with breathless urgency. Inside the villa, Shaquille sat at the same dining table where he had spent most of the night, his massive hands folded in front of him. The police had stopped questioning him hours ago, but the silence that lingered in the room was heavier than any interrogation. He glanced at the clock. His lawyer and a representative from the charity organization he worked with were due to arrive soon. He hoped they wouldn't be too late. Outside, the crowd of neighbors hadn't dispersed. If anything, it had grown larger. Overnight, whispers had transformed into shouts. Words like criminal, kidnapper, and trafficker rang out from the crowd. Miss Janice was at the center of it all, her voice loud and unwavering as she stoked the flames. "I told you something was wrong," she said to anyone willing to listen. "You don't build tunnels under your house unless you're hiding something." Several neighbors nodded in agreement. Even those who had initially defended Shaquille were starting to falter. The evidence seemed undeniable: the rooms, the toys, the photographs of children. The smell, though explained, still clung to the air as an unwelcome reminder of decay and secrecy. Lisa, who had once admired Shaquille, stood clutching her husband Tom's arm. Her face was pale. "I just can't believe it," she whispered. "What if it's true? What if he's been lying this whole time?" Tom didn't respond. He was still trying to reconcile the man he had seen jogging every morning with the evidence unearthed in his basement. When the lawyer finally arrived, the tension inside the house was palpable. He was a middle-aged man in a sharp suit, carrying a briefcase that seemed far too small for the mess unfolding around him. With him came a woman in her early 40s, dressed simply but professionally. She introduced herself as Karen Willis, a representative from a charity called Safe Haven International. The officers wasted no time, laying out the evidence they had gathered. Karen listened quietly, her expression unreadable until they were finished. Then she cleared her throat. "The children you found," she began, "are refugees." The word hung in the air like a thunderclap. Karen went on to explain. Safe Haven International was a nonprofit organization that specialized in rescuing children from war zones and areas ravaged by poverty and violence. They provided temporary shelters, medical care, and educational programs while working to secure legal pathways for resettlement. Shaquille had been one of their largest donors for years, but after visiting one of their facilities overseas, he decided to do more. He offered his home as a temporary safe house, using his resources to provide shelter for children who had nowhere else to go. The tunnel, Karen said, had been built as a part of an emergency evacuation plan. With immigration policies becoming increasingly strict, Safe Haven needed a secure location to house children while their paperwork was processed. The underground rooms were designed to keep them safe and comfortable without attracting attention. The officers looked skeptical, but Karen handed over files, legal documents, permits, and correspondence with immigration authorities. Everything appeared legitimate. Still, the police weren't satisfied. They pointed out that Shaquille hadn't registered the shelter officially, and that housing undocumented children without notifying authorities was a violation of federal law. "It was a risk," Shaquille admitted, finally speaking up. "But it was one I was willing to take. You don't understand what these kids have been through. If you saw the places they came from, you wouldn't ask why. I had to do it." Despite the documentation and Shaquille's explanation, doubts lingered. The officers couldn't ignore the illegal aspects of the operation, and the crowd outside demanded answers. Miss Janice, who had overheard bits and pieces through an open window, refused to back down. "Don't let him fool you," she shouted to the neighbors. "This is just a cover story. How many times have we heard rich men make excuses for their crimes? Think about it. Refugees, hidden under his house. It doesn't make sense." Her words stirred the crowd, reigniting their anger. Protesters began chanting, calling for Shaquille's arrest. The situation teetered on the edge of chaos. But then something unexpected happened. A boy, no older than 10, stepped out onto the porch. He was thin, with dark hair and wide eyes that darted nervously between the officers and the crowd. He clutched a stuffed bear in one hand and a crumpled piece of paper in the other. Miss Janice was the first to notice him. "Who is that?" she demanded, pointing an accusing finger. The boy took a shaky breath and raised the paper. It was a drawing, a crude but heartfelt depiction of Shaquille standing with a group of children, all of them smiling. Above it, written in blocky letters, were the words, "Thank you." The crowd fell silent. The boy began speaking in halting English, explaining how he had fled his home country after soldiers burned his village. He described the journey, hiding in trucks, walking for miles without food, and losing his parents along the way. Tears streamed down his face as he thanked Shaquille for giving him a safe place to sleep and food to eat. Miss Janice's face softened, but she quickly hardened again, clinging to her doubts. "He could be lying," she muttered. "They could have coached him." But as more children appeared, each with their own stories of hardship and survival, her resolve began to waver. She saw the fear in their eyes, the exhaustion etched into their faces. These weren't actors or props. They were children who had suffered more than she could imagine. For the first time in years, Miss Janice felt ashamed. That night, as the police reviewed Karen's documents and the crowd slowly dispersed, Miss Janice lingered on the sidewalk, staring at the villa. Her certainty had been shaken, replaced by questions she didn't yet know how to answer. Could she have been wrong? Was it possible that Shaquille wasn't the villain she had made him out to be? She didn't have an answer, but as she walked home, her footsteps felt heavier than usual. The morning after the revelations at Shaquille O'Neal's villa, Greenville felt different. The crowd had thinned, but the remnants of the chaos lingered: discarded coffee cups, yellow police tape fluttering in the breeze, and deep ruts left by news vans and manicured lawns. The neighborhood, once proud of its pristine reputation, now carried the scars of suspicion and division. Miss Janice stood at her kitchen window, staring at the villa in the distance. The sunlight glinted off its large windows, giving it an almost ethereal glow, but to her it looked less like the fortress she had imagined and more like a house that had weathered a storm. She hadn't slept much. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the faces of the children, their hollow eyes, their hesitant smiles, and the desperate gratitude in the boy's voice as he clutched his stuffed bear. She had spent so much time hunting for shadows that she hadn't noticed the light hidden behind them. But doubt still lingered, even as the media began to paint Shaquille as a misunderstood hero. Miss Janice struggled to fully accept it. Years of mistrust couldn't be undone in a single night, no matter how compelling the stories had been. And yet, there was something she couldn't ignore, a nagging sense of guilt that clung to her thoughts. By noon, she couldn't take it anymore. Clutching a plate of cookies she had baked that morning, she marched across the street and knocked on Shaquille's door. She half expected him to turn her away, but instead he opened the door and greeted her with a smile, warm and genuine, as though nothing had happened. "I thought you might need these," she said, thrusting the plate toward him. He looked at the cookies, then back at her, his smile widening. "Thank you," he said, stepping aside to let her in. The house felt different without the police. It was quieter, more welcoming, though traces of the investigation remained. Scuff marks on the floor, empty evidence bags crumpled in a corner. Miss Janice followed Shaquille to the kitchen, where the table was covered in papers and folders. "I wanted to apologize," she said, her voice faltering, "for everything." Shaquille set the cookies down and leaned against the counter. "It's okay," he said. "You were protecting your neighborhood. I get it." His words hit harder than she expected. She had spent weeks demonizing him, turning him into a villain in her mind, but here he was, calm, forgiving, and far more gracious than she deserved. Before she could respond, Karen entered the kitchen, carrying a clipboard. "Sorry to interrupt," she said, pausing when she noticed Janice. "Oh, I didn't realize we had company." "This is Miss Janice," Shaquille said. "She's one of my neighbors." Karen nodded politely but remained guarded. "We're finalizing the transition plan for the kids," she said, handing Shaquille the clipboard. "We found placements for most of them, but a few are still waiting for approvals." Miss Janice's curiosity got the better of her. "What kind of placements?" she asked. Karen hesitated, then set the clipboard down and explained. Safe Haven had networks of foster families, social workers, and legal advocates who specialized in refugee care. Most of the children would be placed with families while their immigration status was processed, but a few, those with medical needs or missing paperwork, would remain at temporary shelters until arrangements could be finalized. "We're doing everything we can to keep them safe," Karen said, "but it's a slow process." For the first time, Janice saw the scale of what Shaquille had taken on. It wasn't just a few kids hiding in a basement. It was an entire operation, a lifeline for children who had been cast aside by the world. And he had done it all without asking for recognition. The realization unsettled her. She had spent so much time distrusting him that she had failed to see the sacrifices he had made, the risks, the sleepless nights, the burden of carrying so many lives on his shoulders. By the time she left the villa, Miss Janice had made a decision. She couldn't change the past, but she could make amends. The next day, she began volunteering at Safe Haven's temporary shelter. At first, it was uncomfortable. The children were wary of her, and the staff treated her with polite indifference, unsure of her motives. But she persisted, cleaning, organizing supplies, and reading stories to the younger kids. Slowly, things began to change. The children warmed up to her, especially the boy with the stuffed bear. He followed her around, asking endless questions about Greenville and her garden. The staff, seeing her dedication, started giving her more responsibilities. And Miss Janice, for the first time in years, felt like she was part of something bigger than herself. Meanwhile, Shaquille faced his own challenges. The legal battle over the shelter dragged on for weeks, with critics arguing that his actions, no matter how noble, had broken the law. But public opinion was on his side. Stories about the children's journeys went viral, sparking debates about immigration policies and the responsibilities of the wealthy. Eventually, the authorities relented. Safe Haven was granted special permits to continue operating, and Shaquille's villa was officially recognized as a temporary shelter. The tunnel was sealed off, but the rest of the underground space was renovated to meet safety standards. The media hailed it as a victory, but for Shaquille, it was just the beginning. With the legal battles behind him, he doubled down on his efforts, raising funds and expanding Safe Haven's operations. He worked closely with Karen and other advocates, using his platform to bring attention to the plight of refugees. And Miss Janice was right there beside him. She became one of the shelter's most vocal supporters, organizing fundraisers and speaking at community events. Her transformation stunned the neighbors who had once seen her as a busybody and a gossip. Now they saw her as a leader, a woman who had faced her own flaws and emerged stronger. By the end of the summer, Greenville had begun to heal. The villa was no longer a source of fear, but a symbol of hope. The neighbors who had once accused Shaquille now rallied around him, helping with donations and volunteer work. Even Lisa and Tom found ways to contribute, offering rides and hosting events to support the shelter. In the final scene, Miss Janice stood outside the villa, watching as one of the children, the boy with the stuffed bear, climbed into a car with his new foster family. She felt a pang of sadness, but also pride, knowing that he was finally safe. As the car pulled away, Shaquille joined her on the porch. "You did good, Janice," he said. She smiled, brushing away a tear. "So did you." For the first time, Greenville felt whole again, and so did she. Subscribe to the channel not to miss new videos. Share this video with your friends and leave your comments. Write in the comments where you are watching us from.